Jared Isaacman makes a big announcement about the future of Artemis, Rocket Lab delays Neutron again, SpaceX is getting ready to test new Starships, and we got an update on the medical issue on Crew 11. As always, we've got all that and more coming up this week in Spaceflight. There's been a lot of Artemis news this week, so let's get started with that. First, of course, is the Artemis II rollback, which is now delaying the mission's launch to April at the very earliest. Now, I know, last week we were all happy about the highly successful wet dress rehearsal, and we said that NASA was targeting March 6th for the launch of Artemis II. But then other things started to misbehave. The night after NASA officials did the post-wet dress rehearsal conference, talking about how happy they all were with the test results, an issue occurred with the flow of helium to the rocket's upper stage. This upper stage, the Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage, also known as ICPS, uses helium for its pressurization system and also for purging of its propulsion systems. It's worth pointing out that this helium pressurization and purge worked as expected during the wet dress rehearsal, and it wasn't until a day and a half after the test that it failed. Now, it's unclear why it took until then for this system to fail, but the ICPS is located all the way at the top of the SLS core stage, and there's not really an easy way to access it while the rocket is on the pad. It's for this reason that NASA was then forced to roll the rocket back to the vehicle assembly building to perform the repairs there. With SLS back in the VAB, the repair work has begun, starting with accessing the work site in question, which is located inside the rocket's launch vehicle stage adapter. That's the orange cone right on the top of the core stage. NASA says that teams have narrowed down the issue with the helium flow to two potential components: a seal on the quick disconnect for the tubing that supplies helium to the upper stage, and a check valve located at the other end of that tubing. While at the VAB, engineers will also be working in parallel on other tasks needed before another launch attempt. First and foremost are the installation of new batteries on the boosters, core stage, and ICPS for the next launch attempt. The rocket's flight termination system will also be reset and retested so that it complies with the Eastern Range requirements for launch. And the Orion launch abort system batteries will be recharged, and certain items inside the capsule could be refreshed ahead of the next attempt. Now, this work shouldn't take long, but those flight termination system requirements that I mentioned mean that NASA will probably want to roll the rocket out to the pad much closer to the first available launch window in April, which is April 1st. There's a certain certification time for this system, which means that the rocket can't just go out to the pad and sit there for several weeks before the launch. What's kind of ironic, though, is that NASA had issues earlier in the Artemis II campaign with hydrogen leaks, and now the problem was that there was no flow of helium, so kind of the opposite of the leak, I guess. While those hydrogen leaks were successfully remediated, as demonstrated by the last wet dress rehearsal, it's not clear whether they will now hold for a future launch attempt in April. NASA officials have expressed concern in the past that rollouts and rollbacks could deteriorate the seal between the liquid hydrogen tail service mast umbilical and the SLS core stage. However, it's also true that for Artemis I, NASA changed the seals on that umbilical, tested them successfully, then had to roll back the rocket due to Hurricane Ian, and when they rolled out again in November 2022, the rocket launched the first time they went into countdown. So right now, it's a bit unclear whether these leaks will be coming up again on the next launch attempt or not, but of course we certainly hope that they don't. If only NASA could have had more SLS rockets to test and fly and iron out these issues, but such is the different approach to this program compared to, say, New Glenn or Starship. We covered these kinds of differences in a recent video hosted by our own writer Marty, so you should definitely check that out. Well, that idea of having more SLSs to test out and fly to iron out issues seems to have gone all the way up the chain at NASA. In a press conference this week, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman announced big changes to upcoming Artemis missions in order to speed up launch cadence and much more.
We've got issues with low flight rate. A wide objective gap between missions is also not a pathway to success. So what is the right way forward here? So first, today we're announcing a standardization of the SLS fleet to what we'll call essentially a near Block 1 configuration. So the idea is we want to reduce complexity to the greatest extent possible. We want to accelerate manufacturing, pull in the hardware, and increased launch rate, which obviously has a direct safety consideration to it as well. You get into a good rhythm, launching great frequency, you get that muscle memory. We need to start getting back to basics and moving in this direction. So rebuilding the civil servant workforce and restoring core capabilities. Again, that will directly contribute to NASA's launch cadence, where we're going to endeavor to get our launches inside of a year, specifically down to potentially 10 months. And then we are going to add missions. In fact, we're essentially going to pull in Artemis III to launch in 2027 with a revised mission profile. So instead of going directly to a lunar landing, we will endeavor to rendezvous in low Earth orbit with one or both of our lunar landers, test out integrated operations between Orion and the landers, ECLSS systems, even to the extent possible, if we can get up development components of our XEVA suits to test out vehicle interfaces, even just getting an astronaut in a suit in microgravity, we can learn a lot with the idea that we should be learning. And take this information back to inform hardware development, whether it's in the landers or in the suits before Artemis IV, where we will attempt to land on the moon. We are also, as a component of the strategy, endeavoring to preserve up to 2 landing attempts in 2028. So if we get it inside of the 10-month turnaround time that we would like to see, Artemis II will launch on its historic mission in the weeks ahead. Artemis III will have its opportunity, if we can, by mid-2027, which sets us up for an early 28 and a late 28 opportunity.
So this means that the lunar landing will no longer happen on Artemis III, but instead will happen on Artemis IV. Artemis III will still feature a lander, but in low Earth orbit to buy down risk and test the lander's systems with crew, very much like it was done during the Apollo program with Apollo 9. This also allows both SpaceX and Blue Origin to do such testing without the need for on-orbit refueling, since both landers would only need to enter orbit around Earth. Separating out the objectives originally planned for Artemis III between 2 missions is actually something that NASA has considered in past years. NASA's own Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel, known as ASAP, featured this consideration in past reviews of the Artemis program, including in its latest annual report for 2025. Now, the decision is very clear and understandable, but it opened up even more questions that were left unanswered because there really wasn't anything else said at the press conference beyond what we showed earlier. NASA is apparently going with a standardized upper stage for SLS, so does that mean that the exploration upper stage is canceled? Is the second mobile launcher also canceled? And what about the upper stage? Who's building it? If Artemis III is still actually a little over a year away, who's going to fly on the mission? And when is that crew going to be announced? There are so many other questions that we would love to get answered. In fact, when asked about these things, it sounded like they don't really have a firm plan for this just yet.
We're not here to do mission design. Right, we're not here to talk about that. We're not talking about contractual issues. We're not going to talk about that. We have the full support of our industry partners to make sure we standardize the configuration and do the right thing. So we'll just leave it at that.
Now, while NASA may not be ready just yet to talk about specific information regarding this new plan, the agency did release an infographic of what it would look like. Artemis II would launch in 2026 as scheduled, and Artemis III would then be on another regular SLS rocket in 2027 and would dock to either one or both of the lunar landers. Then in 2028, there'd be up to 2 opportunities to land on the moon, but the SLS used on those opportunities would feature the standardized upper stage. In these infographics, that upper stage looks a lot like ULA's Centaur V upper stage. So don't be surprised if NASA ends up stating that it'll be a Centaur V whenever they're ready to talk about this in more detail. Hopefully that time will be sooner rather than later. Rocket Lab updated its investors on its performance in 2025, and as always, that meant that we got a bit more insight on how the company's doing with its upcoming Neutron rocket. Unfortunately, it's delayed once again, but more about that in just a bit, as there are some other interesting things to talk about. First of all, Rocket Lab is looking back at a record-breaking year. Not only in terms of its financial performance, but with 21 launches, it also broke its launch record with Electron. Rocket Lab CEO Peter Beck was happy to point out that no new European or US small satellite launchers were successful in 2025. But Rocket Lab is more than just a rocket company, and it also announced a new type of space-grade solar panels. Now, traditionally, these aren't made of silicon, as silicon-based panels have a low radiation tolerance and a limited life expectancy in space. But the company believes to have solved these issues, and now they're putting silicon-based solar arrays on the market to meet an increased demand for mega constellations and space-based data centers. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at Neutron, Rocket Lab's upcoming medium-lift rocket. Honestly, this update was a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, they're making great progress with many parts coming together ahead of the first flight. But on the other hand, they lost the first stage tank earlier this year, which has definitely impacted the program. Just to recap, here's what happened. The company performed a hydrostatic pressure test in January, during which they pressurized the tank with water. According to Beck, it passed the flight load, but when they tried to push it further to test the structural margins, it ruptured. And this test definitely wasn't supposed to push the tank to failure, as it was meant for the first flight. Rocket Lab ultimately traced the failure back to manufacturing error. It seems that they were trying to go a bit too fast with this one. They had planned to build Neutron first stages using an automated fiber placement machine, a robot that lays down the layers of the carbon fiber structure. But the machine wasn't ready in time, so they contracted another company to build a first stage tank by hand. And guess what? That process was to blame for the failure, as a manufacturing defect reduced the strength of a critical joint around the so-called tank closeout. So yeah, speedrunning rocket development doesn't always work that well. Fortunately, Rocket Lab now has its robot ready for action, and it's working on a replacement tank. They're also taking the opportunity to strengthen some parts of it too. Now, all of this does mean a delay for Neutron, which is now targeting the fourth quarter of 2026 for its first flight. But we all know how that goes, as Q4 launches often slip to the next year. Prove us wrong, Rocket Lab! The rest of Neutron is coming along well, though. The first hardware is now in final integration. Many parts have been qualified, including the thrust structure, and the massive interstage that will connect the first stage to the fairings is currently undergoing qualification testing. Even the second stage is getting ready for testing, and Rocket Lab has installed a structure on the launch mount at Launch Complex 3 at Wallops in Virginia to prepare for these tests. Even though there's no first stage at this time, we might still see some fire and action at the launch pad soon. We'll of course cover that test on a future episode of This Week in Spaceflight. Subscribe so you won't miss it. And while you're at it, hit that like button too. We need to talk about the International Space Station. The lab has been humanity's prime destination in low Earth orbit for over 25 years now, but it's nearing the end of its life. In fact, it was originally planned to only last for 15 years, but the program's partners have pushed the deadline many times. Now it seems that the US government may be pushing for yet another extension too. Under the current plan, NASA and its partners will start decommissioning the ISS in 2030. At that point, SpaceX's Dragon-derived USD orbit vehicle will then slowly lower the outpost's orbit ahead of re-entry in 2031. From that moment, the ISS should be replaced by one, or hopefully multiple, commercial space stations. NASA, ESA, and other ISS partners will then purchase missions to these commercial stations, just like any other commercial customer. Although there are several companies working on these ISS successors, they're coming around rather slowly. Last year, acting NASA Administrator Sean Duffy redefined NASA's program to support the development of these stations in an attempt to accelerate the timeline, but it might not be enough to ensure a continuous presence in low Earth orbit. Now, side note, there is of course China's Tiangong space station, which will continue after the ISS, but that isn't of much use to NASA and its partners, so we can't really rely on that, and we'll have to bank on commercial stations coming online in time. It now appears that worries about NASA's access to low Earth orbit after the ISS have reached the US government, as the US Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation will soon discuss a bipartisan bill that seeks to extend the ISS's life. And if that committee sounds familiar, it's because it's the same committee that Jared Isaacman had to testify for ahead of his confirmation as NASA administrator. That same committee will now discuss an authorization bill that will extend ISS operations to 2032 and beyond. A similar bill was recently discussed by a House of Representatives committee, but that one only requires the NASA administrator to come up with a plan to prevent a gap in access to low Earth orbit. Of course, none of this is official yet, and supporting the ISS beyond 2030 will require involvement from all ISS partners, but at least it's being considered. Now, you might think that not much is really happening in the world of commercial space stations, but that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, Starlab passed an important milestone just this week as it successfully completed its commercial critical design review. With the design now verified, Starlab can move into manufacturing and systems integration. Starlab, a collaboration between several companies led by Voyager Space, is working on a space station designed to launch on a single Starship mission. It's 17 meters long and 7.7 meters wide. For comparison, the ISS's modules are about 4 meters in diameter. Starlab will have roughly half the pressurized volume of the ISS and support a continuous crew of 4 and up to 8 during handovers. The station will feature 3 docking ports for visiting vehicles, have an airlock, internal and external experiment platforms, and a robotic arm. That last one is, of course, the contribution from Canadian partner MDA Space, which also built the ISS's Canadarm. In parallel with the Commercial Critical Design Review, Starlab also reviewed its business plan and concluded that it has a healthy business model and won't just rely on government missions. The station already has several commercial customers lined up. So, with a solid business plan and its design reviewed, Starlab can now start construction. Previously, the company estimated that they'd be ready for launch in 2028, but they haven't mentioned that launch date in quite a long time. Developing space hardware tends to take a while, especially when it's human-rated, so meeting the 2028 date seems unlikely. Suddenly, that 2030 deadline for the ISS seems very close. One of the vehicles visiting Starlab could be the European Nix capsule built by the exploration company. They're developing Nix to serve space stations and even lunar destinations, but its first visit will be to the ISS for a cargo mission. This week, the company shared that it had taken delivery of the pressure vessel for Nix's structural test model. They'll now test the vessel to ensure that it holds up to the pressure requirements for flight and doesn't leak. Earlier this month, they also received the heat shield for the same structural test model. It might seem small in the photos, but Nix will be 4 meters wide, so it's quite a large part. The heat shield will not only protect the capsule from the heat of re-entry, but it's also the part that Nix lands on when splashing down in the ocean. With all of these parts arriving, the capsule is taking shape, and it gets easier to imagine it flying to the ISS sometime soon, or perhaps a commercial station once they come online. Continuing with European space news, we've got some engine testing to report on. This week, the European Space Agency shared footage of an engine named Greta firing up. It's a small restartable engine, producing around 5 kilonewtons of thrust, which the agency envisions to be useful for lunar landers or large kick stages. What's special about Greta is that it uses hydrogen peroxide and ethanol as its propellant, which has a much lower carbon footprint compared to the more traditional monomethylhydrazine. It's much less toxic too, and also much easier to say. The engine was tested throughout the second half of 2025. During its test campaign, it fired up multiple times, firing for over 40 seconds at a time to test stable operations and controlled shutdowns. Next, prime contractor Ariane Group and its subcontractors will start improving the engine, applying lessons learned from the test campaign. With that, they'll work on a flight-ready engine, which they expect to be ready for testing in late 2027. Skyrora also showed off some engine tests this week. The company's 70 kilonewton engine, named Skyforce, will power their upcoming Skyrora XL rocket, the first orbital rocket in their lineup. It's a small-sat launcher, comparable to Rocket Lab's Electron in performance, but much bigger in dimensions, particularly in its diameter. The reason for this is the propellant chemistry of high-test peroxide and Skyrora's own variant of kerosene made from unrecyclable plastic waste. Before flying Skyrora XL, the company wants to launch its suborbital Skylark L vehicle, which has already flown once, though not successfully. Last year, they got a license to fly from Saxavord, but the limiting factor is spaceport availability. That said, with Orbex falling through, some opportunities might open up for Skyrora. Either way, we won't see Skyrora XL launch before next year. The company's head of business, Derek Harris, explained last year on our Europe's Future in Space live show.
For us, when it comes to the demonstrator, which we're hoping was originally aiming to be Q4 26, but with the delay to the L, it's probably going to push it into Q1 27 now, I would expect.
There's one more test we should talk about, and that's a heat shield test for Europe's Space Rider, which is a small reusable space plane designed to fly on Vega C. It'll allow ESA and commercial customers to test experiments in space and return payloads from low Earth orbit. Upon re-entry, the spacecraft will be protected by a heat shield of 21 ceramic matrix composite tiles. These sit on top of a sandwich of insulation material capable of handling up to 1600 degrees Celsius. The thermal protection system is completely removable and reusable up to 6 times. The Italian Aerospace Research Center, which designed the heat shield, recently completed testing. Specifically, they tested whether the system can handle the required vibration loads. For the test, they shook a section of 4 tiles, and the entire assembly, which is just over a meter on its sides, was tested to the maximum loads, even though some of the tiles were never supposed to handle these loads as a result of their positioning on the vehicle. With the heat shield now vibration tested, Spaceflight is getting closer to being ready for its first launch in 2028. Now we'll take a look at some other stories across space, starting with a rather unexpected change in NASA's leadership. Just this Thursday, NASA announced that Ken Bowersox, Associate Administrator for the Space Operations Mission Directorate, will be retiring from the agency starting on March 6th. His deputy, Joel Montalbano, will then take over his position in an acting role. Bowersox is a former NASA astronaut, having flown on 5 space shuttle missions, including a long-duration expedition on board the International Space Station. He left NASA in 2006, and in 2009, he joined SpaceX as Vice President of Astronaut Safety and Mission Assurance, a role that he kept for about 2.5 years. He then returned to NASA in 2019 to work on the agency's human exploration programs, and then eventually this final role in space operations where he's retiring from. At the same time, NASA announced Dana Hutcherson as the new leader of the Commercial Crew Program, replacing Steve Stitch. According to the agency, Stitch hasn't retired, but rather has moved programs over to the Human Landing System program as an advisor. These changes come just a week after the agency released its report on Starliner's crew flight test and its reclassification as a Type A mishap. The timing is really interesting and leaves us wondering if this is a result of that report or just a simple coincidence. SLS wasn't the only large rocket to roll this week. At Starbase, SpaceX rolled Ship 39 out to the Massey Outpost for cryogenic proof testing as part of its pre-launch test campaign. Now this is notable for a few reasons, the first of which is that this is the very first version 3 ship to go into pre-launch testing. We all remember how things went during pre-launch testing for the first version 3 booster, so all eyes will be on Ship 39 to perform correctly. This testing is also being carried out at the static fire test area. While Ship 39 isn't expected to carry out any static fires, it's being tested there, likely to save time, as the stand normally used by SpaceX to conduct cryo-proof testing is currently occupied by a ship test tank. This decision may not be that bad though, considering that the entire static fire test area was remodeled following Ship 36's explosion last year. So with Ship 39's cryo-proof testing, SpaceX will also be able to test out all of those new systems, and now there's even another new contraption at Massey's that might be to test the ship's flaps and simulate the forces of a catch on the vehicle. Hopefully all of this testing goes well, as it'll give us a better understanding of when Starship's 12th flight might occur. Of course, we'll cover all this in much more detail in our next Starship update episode next week, so stay tuned for that. This week we got an update about the medical situation that cut the Crew 11 mission short earlier this year. To briefly recap, the agency decided to return the astronauts early after one of them experienced a medical issue, and while it wasn't an emergency, it did mark the first time an ISS mission was cut short for medical reasons. This week, NASA astronaut Mike Fink posted a statement that he was the affected astronaut and that the medical event required the immediate attention of his crewmates. Their quick response, guided by NASA flight surgeons, helped to stabilize his condition, and the hastened return that followed was to leverage medical imaging tools not available on the ISS. It really shows how NASA is prepared for all types of situations, including rare cases like these. Fortunately, it worked out well. In a post on LinkedIn, Fink detailed his experience and shared that he's doing well and is on the path to a complete recovery. He also thanked the ground teams that helped throughout the process, and above all, his crewmates. Of course, he really didn't have to disclose anything. NASA stays tight-lipped about medical situations to protect the privacy of the astronauts. But thanks, Mike, for sharing this, and we're glad that you're doing well. This is your weekly space traffic report provided by Next Spaceflight. In terms of launches, this week has been dominated once again by Starlink. One of the missions, Starlink Group 6104, was notable for using booster B1067, which was flying for a 33rd time, a record for the fleet of Falcon 9 boosters. It's becoming more common to see more and more flights using heavily used boosters, with a number of flights well in the 20s, and some boosters are even already in the 30s. It really goes to show how reusability is becoming even more commonplace thanks to Falcon 9. Now, while that was the highlight for the launches of the week, in space, we had the departure and return of the SpaceX CRS-33 mission from the International Space Station. This Cargo Dragon mission launched all the way back in August and now holds the record for being attached to the orbiting laboratory. This has been for a good reason, as this Dragon had been fitted with a reboost kit on its trunk. The kit included a separate set of propellant tanks and 2 Draco engines that were used to perform reboosts of the station while the spacecraft was docked to it. During its 6-month stay, it performed 7 reboosts of the ISS, the last one occurring just last month, taking the station to the highest orbit of its lifetime. The reboosts have allowed the Russian segment of the station to conserve propellant, which is sent to the station via transfers using different Progress spacecraft, but which will now be used in the future to control the station during its deorbit process a few years from now. Now, before going on to what's happening next week, if everything cooperates, Rocket Lab may have also launched its first HASTE mission of the year by the time you're watching this, but we couldn't include it in this episode, so we'll cover it in more detail next week. Coming up next week, we'll have yet another string of Starlink missions from SpaceX, with up to 4 on the schedule before our next episode. If things go well, Firefly may also get to launch the 7th flight of its Alpha rocket on a mission called Stairway to 7. All eyes will be on this launch for 2 reasons. The first is that it's a return-to-flight mission for Alpha after a failure that took place during its 6th launch about a year ago. The other reason is that the Alpha rocket flying on this mission is also carrying some upgrades for Alpha Block 2, which will be debuting on the next launch after this. Safe to say, a lot is riding on this mission. No pun intended. Another company that'll be trying to get a successful launch out of their rocket will be Space One in Japan. Its Kairos rocket is scheduled to carry out its 3rd flight next week, following 2 prior launch failures. The first one failed spectacularly back in March of 2024, and another failed later in flight back in December of 2024. These failures left the company on the brink of bankruptcy, but it was able to put together some money thanks to crowdfunding and sponsors. It's in part why the rocket and launch pad are covered in logos from these partners. Up in space, we'll finally have the release of the HTV-X1 Japanese cargo craft no earlier than March 6th. Originally, the spacecraft had been scheduled to depart the station at the end of January, but with the Crew 11 mission ending earlier than planned, station planners extended the spacecraft's stay to let the Crew 12 crew carry out the duties needed to prepare it for departure. Once it leaves the station, HTV-X1 will remain in orbit for another 3 months to conduct additional experiments before deorbiting and burning up in Earth's atmosphere. As always, some things could still pop up unannounced, so we always recommend that you go to nextspaceflight.com or download the Next Spaceflight app on your phone to stay up to date with launches and other events in space. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Alicia Siegel for NSF, and we'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.